Hi there, Leanne from the Vermilion District Chamber of Commerce. Currently, I'm sitting down with Shannon Stubbs, our Conservative candidate in the Lakeland riding. She's also our incumbent. So, without further ado, I will hand it over to Shannon. You can just kind of introduce yourself, let us know why you wanted to run, and whatever else you might think is important for us to know.
Okay, thank you. And Leanne, let me just say, first of all, I really want to thank you and the Vermilion Chamber for providing this opportunity for all candidates from all parties in Lakeland and for all constituents as they get ready to make their decision on September 20th on election day. And also for your work as a chamber, constantly and consistently advocating for the interests of small business owners, of small business workers, and for the community of Vermilion and frankly, for the region around the town, the community of Vermilion as well. I just want to thank you for the efforts that each and every one of you do every day for our region there. And I hope over the last 6 years, I've walked my talk and worked cooperatively and productively with each of you, as well as all the local communities right across the riding. I know it's been challenging for you to host this opportunity today, so I think you deserve a lot of kudos and recognition for making this democratic contribution to this election. So yeah, as you said, I am the federal Conservative candidate running for re-election, and I guess the number one thing that I would say to the people of Lakeland is that since I was first elected in 2015, my sole entire focus and unequivocal motivation has been to fight for the people and the communities in Lakeland, for our values and for Alberta federally. I've been grateful to be able to have some prominent positions that have been allowed me to really be a leader on key issues that impact our riding and our province in particular. As the official opposition shadow minister for natural resources, I advocated for Alberta relentlessly as the world leading environmentally responsible energy producer that we are, and for all oil and gas and pipeline workers, for pipeline infrastructure in all directions to secure Canadian energy self-sufficiency, to reach more export markets, and to phase out foreign oil. And I had the opportunity to lead the fight against the No More Pipelines Bill C-69 and the tanker ban C-48, which a Conservative government will get rid of if we are elected. I've worked consistently to make rural crime a priority in Ottawa. In my first term, constituents probably know I brought forward Motion 167, which called for a series of actions to increase frontline law enforcement resources in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities, to better support victims of crime, and to strengthen consequences and stop the revolving door of repeat offenders, to take real action to combat rural crime. And just 5 months ago, I seconded an Alberta Conservative colleague's private members bill, which would strengthen penalties for break-ins and thefts in rural and remote communities. I've also focused on fighting for the rights of victims in the criminal justice and parole systems. I fought to protect child victims and crack down on offenders of child sexual assault and non-consensual material online. I've supported a Conservative initiative, which was successful, to involve private, not-for-profit, and faith-based organizations with offenders after release to prevent repeat crimes. And I have strongly opposed Liberal legislation to reduce sentences and parole eligibility for many serious offenses. As public safety shadow minister, I also led the fight against Bill C-21, which targeted law-abiding firearms owners, collectors, hunters, sports shooters, and even airsoft enthusiasts, while doing absolutely nothing to tackle gang shootings and illegal gun smuggling. I focused on highlighting and combating foreign interference in Canada, in particular in my work on the Public Safety Committee by regimes like China. And I personally introduced one of many Conservative motions to ban Huawei from Canada. In 2017, and again, most recently this year in 2021, in two different surveys, it was really meaningful to be recognized as the member of parliament who best represents constituents of all the MPs in the House of Commons. And that recognition was even by members and staff of other political parties who, probably hate my guts, but agree that I'm effective. And what though is most important to me, and what I hope the constituents know, is that what really matters the most to me is actually what the people of Lakeland think. And I hope that I've shown every single day that I can effectively represent our priorities and our communities federally. I've been a leading voice against damaging policies and decisions, and Trudeau's anti-energy, anti-resource, anti-business, and anti-Alberta agenda has not only harmed Lakeland, it's divided Canadians and created a serious national unity crisis. I've spoken forcefully in the House of Commons and in national media about the reality of escalating Western alienation and separatist sentiment. And I advocate for and support pursuing real structural changes to empower Alberta and get fairness in Canada. That increasing division, of course, is compounded by the economic crisis that Trudeau has created, driving businesses, jobs, and investments out of Canada, and aiming to phase out the industry that is Canada's biggest private sector investor and top export. I know that the people of Lakeland know that Trudeau has racked up more debt than all of the previous prime ministers combined, and his spending is hurting Canadians' daily lives, driving rising inflation, and of course, increasing prices of everything for everyone. Conservatives will get jobs and businesses back for Canadians. We will recover the million jobs that were lost over the past year and a half, and we'll implement programs to get Canadians and small businesses working again. Conservatives will focus on investing in priorities, on lowering taxes, on reducing the deficit and balancing the budget, and ensure that new projects like pipelines can actually get built. Trudeau has also caused a crisis of confidence in elected representatives and in federal institutions because of his repeated corruption and scandals, his attempts to centralize and increase government power, and his attacks on Canadian rights and freedoms. Conservatives stopped his move to spend tax dollars with no scrutiny or oversight for 2 years, which he tried to do. Conservatives were the only party in the House of Commons to oppose his attacks on free speech in Bill C-10 and Bill C-36. And Conservatives are consistently the party that allows MPs both to initiate and to vote freely on matters of conviction and conscience and to best represent our individual ridings. Conservatives will implement real consequences for ethics violations. I know it drives people crazy that there seems to just be a slap on the wrist. Politicians seem to be able to get away with anything and things that the rest of us never could in our daily lives. So Conservatives will hike the maximum penalty from $500 to $50,000 for ethics violations, prevent MPs from charging speaking fees while they're also elected, and stop lobbying for institutions under criminal investigation, empower the Information Commissioner to direct departments to release documents promptly, and create a foreign agents registry. Lakeland is a vast rural riding. It's the type of riding that Justin Trudeau's Liberals, frankly, just don't care about. And I've advocated for farmers and for farm families. I've fought for rural priorities and concerns. I'm happy to say that a Conservative government would appoint a Minister of Rural Affairs so that rural people and communities are actually a key priority right at the decision-making table instead of being ignored by central Canadian urban politicians or policymakers. Conservatives will tackle rural crime, prioritize completing broadband for rural residents and businesses in 4 years, and fix the agriculture support and infrastructure programs to actually meet rural needs, to be responsive, flexible, and accessible. The last year and a half has been brutal for Canadian families, businesses, and communities. And the Liberals and the left want to continue to erode fundamental civil rights and liberties. The reality is that Conservatives are the only national party that can stop them. Thanks, Leanne.
Okay, well, thank you. So just a reminder to everybody that's watching, we have 10 questions that have been submitted through the Chamber website. Some of the questions were combined because they covered the same topics, and all of the candidates who have participated have been asked the same questions in the exact same order. So question number 1 to get us started is, Quebec has seen many benefits in threatening separation from Canada and has seen Confederation work in their favor while Alberta has been on the losing end. What is your position on separating from the rest of Canada?
So this to me is the biggest damage that Justin Trudeau has done to our country. And I have consistently over the past 6 years cautioned the Liberals on the division that they're creating. Our leader, Aaron O'Toole, when he was elected, the new leader, in his first phone call with the Prime Minister, raised the issue of Western alienation, the prospect of Western separation. I don't want to let Justin Trudeau break our country apart. So that's why I'm also proud to say that Aaron O'Toole and the Conservative Party has committed to reforming the way the fiscalization stabilization program works, to changing the way decisions about the equalization formula is developed, And those measures would result in ensuring that Alberta can no longer be taken advantage of. One of the immediate results of that will be a retroactive $4 billion compensation payment to Alberta. I personally also, as I have done both internally within the Conservative Party and have talked about publicly multiple times, will advocate for structural changes to Confederation. There needs to be changes in seat distribution to actually reflect the population. We need to have a government that will respect the democratic will of Albertans and appoint, for example, only candidates for senators who Albertans have actually elected. And the main priority right now, 10 days from now, is to get rid of Justin Trudeau and these Liberals, to elect a government that will support all provinces, all regions, all sectors in the economy, undo the damage that Justin Trudeau has created, and stop the double standards that have been escalating and held against Alberta in particular, but the West also in general by Justin Trudeau and these Liberals.
Okay. Question 2 is your party going to get us out of the UN? The Paris Accord is going to slowly kill the energy sector in Alberta.
So the targets in the Paris Accord were agreed to by every single country in the world under the previous Conservative government. Here is the reality. Every single country, now including the United States, they were briefly talking about getting out of that deal. Now they're back in it. Every single country is a part of that agreement. Here's why I think Canada needs to be at that table. Because Canada is the most environmentally responsible energy producer in the world. Canada and Alberta in particular has been recognized repeatedly by international experts, by public policy experts in vigorous reviews of our regulatory standards, of our environmental standards, of our labor standards, of all aspects of skill set, R&D, environmental performance and stewardship. It makes no sense whatsoever for Canada to do like Justin Trudeau is doing, which is self-imposing policies and legislation that harm Canada's competitiveness and keep us from being able to provide oil and gas to the world, which the globe will continue to need and to want in future decades. So what Canada has to do is to be at that table to set the record straight about the reality of Canada's track record, to refuse and fight against any imposition of legislation or policies that would harm Canadian productivity, jobs, the economy. And we need to be able to be there to tell the positive story about Canada and to fight against the imposition of policies or legislation that would disadvantage us. So the one thing that drives me the craziest since having been elected in 2015 is the utter lack of knowledge among elected representatives in other parts of the country and from other parties about Alberta's literally world-leading track record on innovation and technology, on environmental stewardship, on even things like 15 years ago, establishing a levy on major industrial emitters, all of which is invested completely in innovation and clean tech. The solutions for emissions reduction are in innovation, technology, adaptability. The Alberta and the Canadian oil and gas sector is necessary for that. And that's what Canada should be telling the world at every opportunity.
Pandemic debt and climate change costs demand a serious, bold plan to grow our economy. What is the plan?
Well, here's what I hear loud and clear from people in Lakeland, that they wanted Conservatives to support programs that were required in an emergency to help the people who were most vulnerable. Of course, as happens in the case of one-size-fits-all big government programs, there were all kinds of challenges in getting supports where it's really needed. And here we are at the end of a year and a half, where over the entire 6 years, Justin Trudeau has racked up more debt than any prime minister, than all the prime ministers combined, where the end of the year finished with $300 billion deficit. His initial promise of balancing the budget in 3 years is long gone, and he has saddled every single man, woman, and child in Canada with more than $30,000 of debt repayments. That jeopardizes future generations. It compromises the ability of future governments to make decisions about their priorities, their needs, their wants. And it is causing inflation, increasing prices, increasing interest rates. And it will put future governments in the position that where they will be forced to choose between continued tax increases, borrowing, spending, while they also simultaneously decrease economic activity, productivity, and then actually, which is something the left never seems to understand, result in less revenue for government priority core programs and services. So that's why Conservatives are running and are frankly the only national party who, starting several months ago, like the beginning of 2021, talking about the need for a concrete economic recovery plan and a path for Canada out of the past year and a half. So we have a very substantial plan that will involve focusing on the hardest hit sectors, focusing on incentives, tax incentives, tax credits, as well as cutting red tape to unleash productivity, particularly for small businesses, which are the backbone of private sector employment in Canada. While Conservatives will put needs before wants, focus on priorities, and reduce the debt with the aim to balance the budget.
Where does not only your party, but you personally stand on the issue of mandatory vaccination, vaccination passports, and the restriction to travel, not only internationally, but also across our whole country?
So I believe that the issue of vaccinations is a private, personal, individual health choice. I believe that people in consultations with doctors and healthcare professionals and people they trust should make those own decisions for themselves and for their families. Conservatives obviously were very strong advocates to the Liberal government to secure sufficient vaccine supply for any and all Canadians who want them. But I do not believe that vaccination should be mandatory. And I do believe that that is an issue of private, personal choice for individuals. On the issue of vaccine passports, there seem to be a couple of things that are being conflated here. So the decisions around vaccine passports for domestic use are up to provincial governments. Federal elected representatives actually, I know it seems like it might be the case, but the fact is federal representatives actually have no ability to either interfere with or tell the provincial governments what to do. So we respect provincial jurisdiction. Provincial governments will make those decisions. Citizens will hold them accountable. The only issue that where the federal government comes into play is on the area of international travel. So here's the reality. There are countries all around the world right now who require disclosure of vaccination statuses for all kinds of disease and illnesses. We can anticipate that countries will be making those decisions in the future. Here's the other thing. Canadians have no control over the sovereign decisions of other countries. So what Conservatives have said we would do is be willing to work with provinces to establish a system or a way for Canadians who want to be able to travel to countries that have made decisions about what requirements are for entry into their country to have an option available that actually will be recognized by other governments in other countries around the world, where they can show their proof of vaccination if it's required in order to travel to those countries. So that's what Conservatives have said we will do. I oppose mandatory vaccines and I oppose vaccine passports in the way that they're being portrayed in this federal discussion.
What are your thoughts on a woman's right to access abortion? What limits do you think should be imposed, if any?
Our Conservative Party will not initiate legislation to intervene in what is actually a provincial decision on that matter about access. Now, on the case of abortion and other issues of conscience, Conservatives are consistently, and actually this was the case despite the claims to the contrary under the former Harper Conservative government as well. Conservatives have consistently been the party that allows for both the initiation of conscience legislation or issues in social legislation, as well as free voting for members of parliament on those issues. So in the past, there have been free votes in the Conservative Party on, for example, our Conservative colleagues' initiative to ban sex-selective abortions. That would be abortions because a child is a girl. I voted in favor of that legislation to ban sex-selective abortion. There was an initiative put forward also by a Conservative colleague to establish that there would be 2 criminal charges in the case of a homicide of a pregnant woman. I voted, there was a free vote in the Conservative Party, and I voted in support of that legislation. My colleague, Kelly Block from Saskatchewan, recently brought forward a legislation protecting conscience rights for healthcare practitioners. That's an initiative I support. The Liberals called the election before that initiative could actually get through the parliamentary process. But that initiative is in the Conservative campaign platform that we would affirm the conscience rights of individual healthcare professionals as their professional organizations and their advocates fight for. So this is a key issue, I think, for people to decide when you are picking your member of parliament. It really behooves people to check the facts about when and how members of parliament really can vote independently and freely on social issues, on conscience issues, and on issues which might, disproportionately or uniquely impact the constituency that they represent. And I'm proud to say that the Conservative Party has a black and white track record of being that party, and I've been able to do that as the member of parliament for Lakeland.
Where do you stand on the proposed capital gains tax for the sale of your principal residence?
You know what? I'm so glad you asked that question, because I would hearken all our minds back to the 2019 federal election, and you will probably recall that Conservatives were warning that the Liberals were going to do that they were going to establish this capital gains tax on the sales of home equity. Now, everybody at that time said, well, the Liberals said, Conservatives are making it up. We don't have any plans to do that. That's not true. Conservatives actually had an internal document from the Liberal government advising them to do that, and that was a policy discussion in their own paper. And now Canadians need to know this campaign, it's in their platform, even recently admitted by one of their candidates in a forum like this just a couple of days ago. So the Liberals absolutely are intending on doing this, and as we did in 2019, Conservatives continue to oppose that prospect.
If BC10 passes with its present wording, is promising to censor personal online content. Will you elaborate on the effects of an appointed agency having this power and the potential legal penalties they can enforce without a defense mechanism being provided to the accused content provider?
I really appreciate that conversation. It was a key debate over the last year and a half. And it was a classic situation of the Liberals saying they were doing one thing while their legislation actually showed something completely different. So Conservatives, I hate to say this to Canadians, but Conservatives were the only party in the House of Commons to oppose C10 and to lead the fight to protect Canadians' free speech, to protect their ownership over their own online content, over their own social media posts and accounts, and to say that the concept of the government becoming the body that should dictate what Canadians can say and can post on their social media accounts is wrong. So the good news for the people of Lakeland and for Conservatives and for everybody who is concerned about that encroaching power grab by the Liberals to interfere with the rights of free speech and expression by among all Canadians is that as a result of when the parliamentary session ended and then Justin Trudeau called the election, C10 is dead. So that gives, I hope, some assurance to everybody. The conservative track record is clear on C10. We were the party to oppose it. We have already raised concerns with the legislation. They just tried to bring in at the 11th hour, which is similar in nature, C36. We would not proceed on that legislation. And but it is one of the reasons why Conservatives and Canadians have to think really, really thoroughly about the opportunity that is in front of us right now in this election that none of us want, none of us understand why we're having. But we have this opportunity in 10 days, because the reality is this: the Liberals will keep trying to interfere with civil liberties, with civil rights, with free expression, with free speech. They're backed by the left-wing parties, the coalition of the left, to do this. All of those parties supported their efforts, and they will try it again. So that's why I hope Conservative voters will stick together and take this opportunity we have to boot Justin Trudeau out of office.
What TRC calls to action do you intend to implement in Lakeland, and how will you do it?
I appreciate this question very much. I have worked very closely and I think cooperatively with the 9 Indigenous communities across Lakeland, the First Nations and the Métis people, as well as have provided support and responsiveness to Indigenous and Métis residents in communities that aren't either on reserves or in settlements. It's interesting. I find a lot of the time the Liberals and the left seem to forget this fact, that it was in fact Prime Minister Harper and the Conservative government which first of all offered the historic apology for residential schools, recognizing what it was, which was a government overreach intervention in parental authority, in families, in communities, removing children from families, which are the building blocks of society, and trying to detach them from their families' abilities to pass on their cultures, their languages, their norms, their faiths, their beliefs. It's Prime Minister Stephen Harper that recognized that and launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in response. What actually is notable is for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that this is the most important responsibility or most important relationship to him of any relationship in the entire country, and his multiple failures, frankly, on acting on the variety of recommendations within the Truth and Reconciliation report, but also on meeting very basic needs, like finally fixing the centuries-old problem of boiled water challenges on reserves, increasing education opportunities for Indigenous people, increasing jobs and skills training for Indigenous people, dealing with fixing housing in reserves, implementing financial transparency and accountability so that individual Indigenous people can have the same transparency and access to information about the decisions of their leaders as all other Canadians with all other levels of government do. So specifically with regard to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, in the wake of the, I think now more than 5,000, if I'm not mistaken, children's bodies that have been found in unmarked graves in residential schools across Canada, there are a number of specific recommendations that Conservatives have especially been highlighting. And for the life of me, I do not know why the federal government hasn't acted on them already. So in response to that issue in particular, Conservatives have said very clearly there needs to be action on the recommendations. They're numbers 71 through 76. But what they talk about is dedicating resources and partnerships with all levels of government, Indigenous communities, to identify remains and the bodies of children sorry, at those sites, to work with families and their communities to find out what the families, the relatives, and the communities want to be done, either to commemorate those sites, to recover the remains, to have burials with their own families or back in their own communities. These recommendations also call for ensuring that any remaining documents and any information about crimes that have occurred in residential schools and the deaths of children and bodies in unmarked graves are disclosed, to all appropriate authorities and made available to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So these are a number of action items that frankly the government should be taking. What I hear loud and clear from the people of Lakeland across the riding, regardless of where they stand on like what I would say become kind of egg-headed debates by the most privileged and elite people about colonialism or systemic racism or terms. People want to see action. And that's exactly what I hear from the Indigenous leaders and Indigenous residents in Lakeland. They don't want politicians to be making speeches with hands over their heart and just saying about flowery words. They want these issues to actually get dealt with for the well-being of Indigenous Canadians and frankly, all Canadians. So for Truth and Reconciliation in particular, those are a couple of the actions that, that we have been talking about with respect to this most recent issue. But as personally, as the member of Parliament of Lakeland, I hope I'm simply walking my talk by being a member of Parliament that has worked productively, closely, and regularly with Indigenous and Métis communities and residents. And I have aimed to represent their interests and their priorities and their values just as strongly as all the people in Lakeland. And to be quite frank, what I find is that the key priorities that Indigenous leaders raise with me are the exact same key priorities that elected representatives municipally and provincially in every community across the riding raise. They want to be safe, secure, they want educational opportunities, they want jobs, they want safe housing, they want more frontline law enforcement to keep kids out of gang lifestyle, to reduce crime. They want to be able to provide for themselves, their families. And in Lakeland, one of the major issues I've been fighting against was this rude awakening I had when I first got elected, that people in other parts of the country, and specifically from other parties, actually believe this myth that all Indigenous people and Indigenous communities are opposed to oil and gas development and natural resources development. Because of course, in Lakeland and frankly, across Alberta, for decades, Indigenous people and communities have been partners, owners, workers, service and supply contractors, and developers of energy resources. And so I'm glad Conservatives actually have a comprehensive platform on this about skills training, jobs opportunities, and education, which will, I think, improve in real terms, the well-being, the outcomes, the futures for Indigenous people, which of course is the youngest population of any community across the country.
What are your thoughts on conversion therapy? Will you please share your opinion on how this will affect a person or parent wanting counseling to affirm biological identity? Do you believe the present wording denies the ability for a counselor to present a full spectrum of choices for a child dealing with gender dysphoria? Please address how this affects the professional and faith counseling positions as well.
That's a very good question, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to address it. Let me say that my deliberations and my decision over Bill C6 was among the most difficult decisions and choices I had to make as a member of Parliament in the past 6 years. Conservatives have said very clearly, and my position is very strongly, that children must be protected from harm, from coercive practices, from endangering their physical and their individual well-being. And so Conservatives, as we have said repeatedly, would ban conversion therapy, but want to and will protect the rights of parents and the important abilities and spaces for conversations, for counseling, for medical professionals, for therapists, and in faith-based situations. This issue is one that I think Justin Trudeau and the Liberals actually showed how crass they are, almost beyond anything. So the first thing is that they could have taken action on this issue anytime in the last 6 years. They, of course, did it right before they planned to call a federal election. They compressed the debate, tried to rush through the legislation. In the actual committee testimony on this legislation, there was repeated medical professional and civil rights experts and a therapist who said that the way the legislation was written would potentially immediately criminalize conversations and counseling and, good faith, like mentoring and discussions that that parents, that faith leaders, that counselors might have with kids and with teenagers. The bill involves a serious consequences, 5 years in jail. So the seriousness of the decision, I think, cannot be underestimated. And my view ultimately was that for a bill that has those kinds of consequences, elected representatives better be 100% bulletproof sure about the impacts. And given that there was overwhelming legal and medical expert and testimony, and from a whole other array of advocates as well, saying that bill as the Liberals wrote it would potentially criminalize conversations and counseling. And then Conservatives put forward an amendment that the Liberals easily could have adopted into that bill, which would have provided those explicit protections, which ironically, the Justice website actually had as a description of the bill, but it wasn't embedded in the law. And the only thing that matters is what is actually in the law. The Liberals refused to adopt that amendment. And so Conservatives had to make this choice on which we had a free vote. And so I ultimately voted against, I voted for the legislation on second reading to allow it to go through committee, to ensure that it would have this democratic debate with the mindset that we need to take all and every efforts to protect children. And it didn't occur to me that the Liberals would not actually adopt this very common sense amendment, which literally reflected their own description and rationale for the bill directly into the legislation. But it frankly was only about politics, only about divisiveness. That's what they chose. And so ultimately, as Conservatives, we voted freely. And in the very final stage of the bill, I did vote against it because I was not convinced that there were sufficient protections for exactly those issues that the questioner was wondering about.
Okay. So our last question is COVID debt, climate change costs, the need to repair our aging infrastructure. The costs are going up all around us. How do we pay for all of this? A serious, bold strategy to grow our economy is our only way forward, and local residents have the right to know where their candidates stand before Election Day.
Yes, I 100% agree with that questioner. And frankly, I think it's a travesty that discussion about economic recovery, about Canada's economic future, about where Canada goes from here has really been absent from the other political parties in this election campaign, but also frankly for months. Earlier this year, months ago, Conservatives were already asking for the Liberals to give a concrete plan for reopening the economy and for Canada's economic recovery. So that is the priority focus of the Conservative Party in this election. And I agree, it will require action on a number of fronts. So we have, and I encourage people to look at the recovery plan so that people can get the details. But we have a series of tax incentives and tax credits, which will, for example, support small businesses on all new hires, 50% of wages for all new hires after the emergency wage subsidy is wound down. We have a number of tax credits and incentives which will support personal investments in small businesses, which will support capital investments by small businesses. We will double the Canada Workers benefit to support low-income workers and low-income families. We will, and this is important, I think, sometimes, I guess maybe it's not like the most glamorous issue ever, but I know that I hear this very regularly from people in Lakeland, and I think business owners will agree. It's not just high tax rates and high costs, but red tape costs businesses and business owners time and money. So the Conservative Party will appoint a minister of red tape reduction, and there are a series of actions that that minister must take. So there will need to be at least one red tape reduction bill every year. A Conservative government will work with small business owners, and with public policy experts and with all levels of government, because often what happens is the pancaking of red tape in multiple jurisdictions. That is such a burden to small business owners. So we will work with all those partners to identify what are the red tape costly regulatory and duplicative burdens to ease that system. We have committed to overall simplifying the tax system in itself, reducing rates, making it easier for small business owners who run businesses of $60,000 of revenue or less annually. So there are a number of more strategies and commitments beyond that, but I couldn't agree more with that questioner that is absolutely where a new Canadian Conservative government has to be focused on all the measures to unleash economic growth, economic productivity, and get small businesses and the private sector back up on its feet, so that the economy so the economy can recover in all sectors and charge on all cylinders right across the country.
Okay, so that's the end of our questions. I want to thank you for your answers. And if there's anything else you would like to say in closing, now would be your time.
Okay, well, I want to thank you again, Leanne, for this opportunity. I think it's really important. I'd also like to recognize and thank all the other candidates from all the other parties in this election. And again, I really want to give you kudos for giving us opportunity, both to candidates and to constituents, as they make this important decision. I hope the people of Lakeland know that every single summer since I was elected, I and my team have door knocked in the 52 communities across Lakeland. I've worked with MLAs from all political parties. I've worked with local municipal councils, and as I mentioned before, with the 9 Indigenous communities to represent Lakeland's interests federally. It's important to me that the people of Lakeland know that I do that every single day, not just during election campaigns. I know it's a thing to say, oh, politicians are on the doors again, but I made that commitment very early on when I was first elected in 2015, and I kept that commitment to be to door knock and to hear from residents, to work with communities every single day since. Here's the reality about this election. The decision for the voters in Lakeland, I think, is twofold. It's one, who can best advocate for them, for our riding, for our values, for our province. But importantly, it's also about who will actually have the opportunity to really get things done federally. There have been, of course, many claims, many aspirations, sometimes some misrepresentations from other parties, but the reality is this: there is only one national party actually in the position right now to remove Justin Trudeau and the Liberals from government, and it's the Federal Conservative Party. My own record is clear. I stand up for Lakeland. I believe in freedom, in individual rights and responsibilities, in limiting the scope and power of government. I'm proud that Conservatives are always the party that votes freely and enables MPs to represent their ridings with the freedom to introduce legislation on all and any issues. I have fought tirelessly for the oil and gas sector in Lakeland, for Energy East, for Keystone XL, for TMX, for the Northern Gateway, for a multi-use national energy corridor in all directions, for LNG, for the workers' families, the businesses, the Indigenous communities hurt by the Liberal and leftist attacks on the energy sector, which is a driving economic force that provides good jobs and sustainable livelihoods for so many people, obviously right across Lakeland and Alberta, but really right across the country. And if re-elected on September 20th, I will continue to speak truth to power about that economic reality and for rural people and communities. I've stood up to the heavy-handed and arbitrary approach of the Liberals' firearms ban. It should be clear that Conservatives will repeal Bill C-71 and introduce a framework to take the politics out of firearms classification, to actually consult firearms owners, manufacturers, and focus on public safety, which is what's most important, and to enshrine it in legislation instead of these unilateral government edicts that are arbitrary bans that criminalize law-abiding firearms owners and sports shooters. As the public safety shadow minister, I hope the people of Lakeland know I led the debate against Bill C-21 by the Liberals, and frankly, that bill never even got out of the first stage of debate. Conservatives would focus on combating criminals and gangsters and prioritize and support victims. I advocate relentlessly for Lakeland and for Alberta, both in my own caucus and in the House of Commons. So as I mentioned before, Conservatives will fix the fiscal stabilization program and the way equalization is decided so that Alberta isn't continuously taken advantage of. Conservatives will actually respect and protect provincial jurisdiction, stop double standards against the West, and secure an economic recovery in all sectors in all regions. The reality, I think we're probably all agreed on this in Lakeland, is that Justin Trudeau called this election for selfish partisan reasons, not for the best interests of Canadians and for the country. But we have the opportunity to get rid of him and his Liberal government in the next 10 days. Justin Trudeau has divided Canadians. He's created a serious national unity crisis. He's driven Canada's economy into the ground, and he's trampled on Canadian rights and freedoms. He's caused corruption scandal after corruption scandal and cover up after cover up, and he needs to go. The Conservatives are the only federal party that can get rid of Trudeau from government and that can secure the future for all Canadians. So ultimately, Leanne, this is what I hope. I hope I've walked my talk and that I've earned my keep for the people of Lakeland. And I hope I'll earn once again the trust and confidence to continue to fight for all of us in Ottawa.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Shannon. And I'm sure all of the constituents will appreciate this video. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the initiative.